What was the first brand you sort of fell in love with and why?
I think growing up, I loved so many brands. I loved Nike. I loved Apple. I loved, there was kind of brands in our fridge that I loved. I loved what Coke was doing. More than brands specifically I loved the dimension of business that was brand. That kind of more emotive feeling layer, felt more imaginative, that just sat across, like the magic that just kind of sat with a handful of brands. I didn't really know brand strategy existed, but growing up I was just really passionate about brands. I had a strong opinion on what sneakers were better than others, what jeans were better than others. And, many of those brands have completely disappeared. But I really remember brand being this kind of important navigational point for me. I was like, why do I like certain record labels and not others? Why do I like certain clubs and not others? Why do I like certain jean brands and not others? And then I came to realize that it's this dimension called brand, which is where the story, the feeling, the narrative resided. I just was so drawn to that. And if this question kind of goes on to so how did I kind of go from there into making a career of it? I just kind of always had a bit of a crush on that area and pointed my kind of career at it as best I could. Landed in an advertising agency in Sydney, had a very, very strong brand strategy department. That's why I discovered there was people paid to kind of sit and think and invent that layer of business and kind of really conceptualize it and kind of really plan out how to make it happen. And, I've been kind of doing it ever since.
Sick. I think what I'd love to understand before we jump into some of the points is what would you say your definition of a brand is in a sentence? And then what is brand strategy? And again, I ask a lot of dumb questions, but I think it's important because the smart answer lies in the dumb question.
I wish I was a dumb question. I wish I had a smart answer. I think brand is the intangible layer that sits atop any business or product that we end up intuitively feeling, and it floods them with color and emotion and drive. And that for me is what brand is, that intangible layer that really resides in people's hearts and minds about a brand. The way people talk about these products and brands in a way that completely exceeds anything that's related to the business or the product in a tangible sense. That for me is what brand's about. And brand strategy really is a discipline that exists because if you believe that that's powerful, then you actually want to spend some time seriously thinking about what you want that layer to mean, what you want it to happen, what you have permission to kind of build into that layer and how you cultivate it over time. Because it is incredibly valuable, but it's also precious. You can fuck it up really easily. So if you're not paying attention to it and if you're not being intentional about it, you can get it completely wrong. And that's why we kind of walk around supermarkets or streets and just feel certain ways about some brands and completely cold about others.
How would you architect that feeling though, from your side? So again, say you were to write a brand strategy, what are the one on a piece of paper? Is it on a piece of paper? I've sat up at some people and say you should write it as a piece of prose. I've had other people say you should put a fucking vision board up.
Yep.
What's your perspective of say you're creating a brand, what are the 1, 2, 3 things you put in that brand strategy?
Yeah, well, I think, there's kind of 2 layers to that question. There's a very specific question around what's a good output of a brand strategy. And then there's what are the right ingredients? What separates the good from the bad? So if we talk about ingredients, I actually kind of advocating for a far more ambitious, audacious view of brand strategy than maybe some places are willing to play at the moment.
Cool.
And the areas that we think are really interesting start fundamentally with a very, audacious and, I'd say kind of almost, very positive belief around what brands can be. We have quite a lot of audacity around brands. And specifically what we think is that brands should actively try and claim a role in culture, not just a position in their category. And, the ingredient, the way to get there is starting to ask questions around what the hell's going on in the world. What are the kind of problems at play and where might we be able to place this brand to have that kind of impact? Then in terms of what a great output could look like, all of the above. I think some organizations gravitate towards a very technical framework. That's what speaks to them. Some gravitate towards a long period of prose. But I think at the end of the day, what all brand strategy should have is a really elegant single sentence that can clearly articulate why that brand deserves to exist in a way that feels believable, compelling, true, possible. And that kind of short sentence should be something that everyone in an organization is able to kind of recite, basically.
Interesting.
Should I break this down a little bit? Because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, which is...
Because it's in the zeitgeist. People talk about this, and it's like, but I'd love to get your take on it,
Well, brand strategy has been going on for over half a century. Really robust debates around how you should build a brand strategy. So I think it's important to put stuff into somewhat of a historical context.
Yeah. So take me back to the beginning.
One of the really early moves in brand strategy, not the first, but a really important point, was this idea that brand strategy, that single sentence, ultimately should articulate a positioning. And it was called a positioning because that's quite an evocative word that describes exactly what you were trying to do. If you were going to launch a product, you needed to talk about how it positioned against the other brands in its category. So if you had a tin of soup, for example, or a new cereal, the idea of positioning was, well, help me mentally map how you're different to the rest of the brands in the category. And positioning really asks brands to think about what's their point of difference, what's their USP, what makes them slightly better or slightly different to their competitors. And that was a really, really powerful and sensible kind of framework. It makes intuitive sense, right? Tell me why you're slightly better. Tell me why you are launching this brand into a category and why this category needs you. And then a bunch of stuff happened. I think people started to kind of become much more brand savvy and start to kind of interpret brands much quicker, which created this bullshit filter that meant like kind of positionings that were a little bit made up kind of fell away. I think we also had a very shifting media landscape, which meant that 50 years earlier, in a very TV-centric marketing model, if you had a positioning, you had this soundbite you could go on TV once a night for a couple of weeks and say, and people would land and get it. Now, if you think about the media landscape, well, we're not just seeing you on TV, we're not just seeing you in store, you're in our feeds all the time, you're in PR, the world is happening to you and brands are expected to react to it in some sort of way. So if the only thing that you have is a soundbite, we have 30% less sugar, we come with a toy or whatever it might be, that becomes a really kind of crude tool for dealing with the world as we kind of find it. So there was a media shift that happened as well, not only this brand savviness. And so where the world started to move was this kind of question of purpose. Actually, brands don't just need to have their position in their kind of culture, in their shelf. They need to have this kind of place within culture. And so this kind of philosophy of purpose came along, and everyone got really, really excited by purpose. Now,
what year is that? Just rough,
I think it probably started with Dove Real Beauty, and that's probably over a decade old now.
Cool.
Right. But I actually think we're now entering a phase of Purpose 2.0 because we've actually kind of seen purpose play out and we've learned a lot about it. That actually when your brand's kind of reason for existence is completely untethered to your product and is only really lived in the marketing, people also don't really connect with those brands. Those brands don't seem to be firing in the same way. So when you ask me, what do I think a great brand strategy looks like now, it's probably this new version of purpose,
right,
which is incredibly aware of the world, incredibly aware of the consumer, incredibly aware of the role that the brand can play at that intersection, but without ever overstretching. I think we've kind of had this era of kind of water bottles trying to solve world peace, or a dog food brand trying to solve world hunger, or whatever it might be. Those kind of overreaches probably weren't quite working, but we still need brands that kind of understand what's going on in the consumer's life and want to play an active role. And that's what I kind of think of when I think of Purpose 2.0.
Go more into Purpose 2.0. So when you say, because I think on that wonderful presentation, you said people are trying to fix brands or fix their brand when actually they should fix a problem and that will fix the brand. Like, talk to me, detail that to me.
The question is like, okay, cool. You kind of see a role for purpose, but you think there's some overreaches. How the hell do you solve that? And it came back to a really simple question, which is actually what brands really need to be asking themselves is what problem in the world that they fix. And I want to break that down a little bit so it doesn't kind of run away. I think brand strategy can be built by asking three questions.
Yep.
Firstly, what are the resources of the brand? And this is a question that I don't think many marketing functions or brand owners necessarily ask themselves because they don't see it as in their purview. They kind of go, I've got a marketing budget, I can't think about it. But I actually think the first thing a brand owner should do is look at the resources of the brand. And the resources of the brand aren't just the marketing budget. It's also the factories. It's the product. It's the community that sits around it. These are the resources that the brand has. The next thing to do, having kind of assembled that kind of army, is to look at the world and say, well, what is the most kind of meaningful problem we could throw this at without overreaching? So where could these resources really make a difference? And of course, we don't want to kind of overreach and kind of go, like I said, like we've all had like peanut butter brands trying to solve world peace, but kind of go, where is a tension in the lives of the people we're trying to sell to that we might be able to play? And when you find that overlap, there's a really powerful place for a brand to have a really active role in culture and kind of move the dial forward. You kind of having the best of kind of purpose, which is a really active, modern way of seeing a brand, but actually connecting with what's going on with consumers.
You analyze the culture, you analyze your resources. How do you pick the problem?
Yeah. Well, it's so funny because I work with two types of brands. I work with really, really big brands who often kind of are needing to find something to say, and I work up with startups who often have too much to say. So the idea of, oh my God, we've got so many problems. I think so many people founding a brand do that. They're incredibly ambitious people, incredibly audacious. So of course they kind of go, here are 4 or 5 things I think we could meaningfully do. It is worth zooming into that question though, because actually there's lots of problems you could throw the brand's resources at. I think
any examples as well to bring.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should dive into Boldbean after this and talk a little bit about the journey we went on with them, because I think it's so super interesting. But I actually think the question really is, what problem is really real and present in the life of your consumer? Now, that's very different to a problem that might interest them. So I think everyone has a broad interest with food safety, the environment. But actually, for some consumers, that's not necessarily present in their day. I think you've got to look at their real life concerns and ask them what is actually going on in their real life that you can kind of solve. And I think that starts to filter it down. I think there's a real difference between problems that interest consumers, things that are on the periphery that absolutely matter to them, versus problems that impact consumers, stuff that's affecting their day-to-day life.
Go more into the impact versus interest.
Yeah. So again, and I don't want to sound flippant with some really significant issues, but these significant issues I think are rarely the kind of purview of brands. Sometimes brands are just completely inappropriate playing in these spaces. So issues like world hunger, for example, or peace, or things like this, very kind of substantive and important issues. You'll find in most target consumer groups that those things are of massive interest. Of course they are. They're massively important. But then you look at the resources you've assembled and you've asked yourself, well, are we going to make a dent there? And more importantly, is it going to allow us to make a connection with this consumer group that we absolutely need to reach? Or are we just going to interest and entertain them?
How do you do that with Boldbean then?
So I think, Boldbean's a really interesting example of a founding story actually with multiple angles at start. So when Amelia was kind of sketching and building out Boldbean and she would hope, I think she would have her version of this story, but as I recount it, early on there was multiple things that the brand was pointed at, because actually in Bean she'd kind of stumbled across this kind of superfood. And I use that in the broadest sense of the term, right?
Sure.
Something that was kind of, she would talk a lot about the ability to kind of solve farming issues and issues with soil. Massive issue. She would talk about the kind of movement away from meat, or at least a need to move society away from meat. And would talk a lot about actually the fact that this kind of ingredient, most people were kind of overlooking it because, it just broadly been presented them in a really shit way. I want to break down those 3 problems to maybe make the point I was making a little bit clearer before. A powerful brand will have a reason to interact and add to the lives of a consumer every single day. In everything it does, it will have a reason that it can kind of connect and advocate and add value to the lives of consumers. I think when you go to soil, for starters, like you and I probably would both agree. That sounds.
Is that the sort of the first thing that if someone listens, is like a brand should add value, and do you say an excitement or?
It should find a way to interface with the consumer every day.
Yes.
It should have a point of view on the life of its consumer and what problems that consumer faces that it can resolve.
Yeah.
And I think so much conversation around purpose has encouraged us to think really, really big that we sometimes become out of touch. So let me step through those 3 examples, right? Soil, for starters. I think you and I would both agree that's massively important. But then we kind of went on this kind of projective exercise. Okay, how am I going to engage you every single day in a Instagram feed, in our newsletter, in, talking on podcasts, if I'm talking about dirt? Absolutely, that's massively important, but it's really hard to have a really personal connection day in and day out, because that's something over to the side of my life. It's not something really driving my day to day. The next thing was this kind of need for society to move away from meat.
Yeah.
Again, it's just quite a tricky place to start a relationship, right? Which is, I'm going to try and coach you out of something you want to do through my point of view. What that relationship...
Quite coercive, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the last one was this kind of sense of there is a foodie culture in this country that's kind of phenomenal, and a real appetite for home cooking and making stuff from scratch and feeling like you're, have a bit of a foodie kind of element to you. And that was actually something that the brand's resources could really aid. It was a far better ingredient. It was started by Amelia has kind of a background in food and chefs and knows that industry incredibly well.
When you're talking about her background, that's a resource.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Interesting, because you originally said like, a lot of people forget about the resource thing. Because as you say, if you've gone this big, as you say, the bigger problem could be the soil thing.
Yeah.
But actually, it's like, what resources have we got? Well, Amelia's connected to the chefs.
Yep.
The chefs are the ones who can be the evangelists.
Yeah.
The chefs are the ones who she's already got the links in with, who can promote the cookbook on there.
Exactly.
Wow. Okay, so it's like, what resources have we got? What are the three what problems can we solve in the world? And then I suppose the next step, asking which ones actually aligns with our resources, or what?
Yeah.
How do you?
Well, this is where people kind of like look for an equation in brand strategy and kind of go, wouldn't it be like, come on, what's the algorithm here? Like, I've got my resource, I've got my problems, like, give me the answer. And there is a need just to kind of do that kind of magic matchmaking stuff, which is why I love this job. While so many people in the brand space love their jobs, but it's also why it drives people like CFOs and certain kind of ops people nuts, right? That's just the tension of brand building. But, you can start to kind of see how in the analysis, it's like, okay, look, and by the way, that brand today continues to be a massive force in farming. What they have done for farmland and for soil regeneration by simply having a successful business like they do is insane. That remains part of it. They have, I think, dragged lots of people out of meat consumption to bean consumption through their foodie strategy. So it's not to say those were ignored, but when we talked about the way the brand was going to deal with people and interact with people, we thought we could talk to them about something people think are important, but actually is quite a hard place for day-to-day relevance, soil. We could talk to them about the need to kind of eat less meat to save the planet, which again is valuable, but again, a tricky place to start a relationship. Or we could talk about the shared passion, which is foodiness, and kind of find the shared love of like foodiness and restaurants and, cooking and recipes and inventiveness, and use that shared passion point. And that is just such a stronger place to start the foundation. We've got this incredible product that actually makes it way easier to cook at home, immediately makes meals better. It's much more fun to play with than a jar of kind of really overly cooked beans. We've got this incredible product. Like, that just feels like such a more powerful place to start in. And the fix then isn't ginormous. It's not as seductive as saying this is a brand that exists to create world peace. That's a really seductive mission. Their mission is far smaller, about kind of creating an obsession around beans via kind of being a brand obsessed with like foodie credentials. It's a smaller mission, but it's just so much more appropriate for the brand. And because it has this like very deep connection with consumers and people actually care about it, and it starts to resolve some of the frictions in their life, the brand's going flown.
There's almost like a massive irony. It was like the bigger the and more sort of salacious the big save the world strategy is, the less impactful it is.
Yeah.
Whereas actually, if you sort of flip on the end, it's like, what's the micro strategy that over time will actually have a bigger impact? Because as you say, if we get more people obsessed with beans through foodies, through chefs, then actually, ironically, you're going to solve. Well, not ironically, happily, you're going to solve the soil situation and the meat consumption situation.
Exactly. And this is where you shift, that's the difference between being a phenomenal brand and a phenomenal business. Like, that stuff is really important to the business. It aligns
What's
with
the difference between a business and a brand?
Well, the business is the operations, at how you deliver the product and how you create the brand and how that gets to market. You could imagine, there's the brand layer, but there's so much more going on behind the scenes. How you treat your workforce, how you treat your suppliers, how you do business, the values of it, that still can be operated, and continues to do really good and powerful things because it's a really phenomenal business. But the brand strategy focus needs to be far more singular and in my case, kind of far more pointed at the lives of consumers.
Hey guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Hope you're loving the episode. I'd appreciate a really small yet significant favor, por favor. Please, may you click the subscribe button, get in the comments, tell me what you think about the episode, tell me what you think we need on the show. It may not seem much, but it really helps us grow and helps us get bigger guests. Thank you so much.